Sometimes the truest loyalty comes from the ones who never speak a word. When everything else falls away, it's the quiet companionship that carries us through. 72-year-old cowboy Elijah Brand thought he'd breathed his last breath, bleeding in the Arizona desert, miles from anywhere, shot by rustlers and left for dead. No phone, no help coming, just the setting sun and the taste of dust. But Clara, his aging donkey, had other plans. For 17 years, she'd walked beside him through grief and hardship. Now, without command or training, she knelt down and let him crawl onto her back. What happened next defied everything anyone thought possible about an old farm animal. How did one stubborn donkey carry a dying man miles through the wilderness and save his life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other. Morning in Elijah Brand's 72 years of living quiet, deliberate, and measured by the rhythm of work that needed doing. He'd risen before dawn in the small adobe house that sat at the edge of his property, a modest spread of land in southern Arizona where the Sonoran Desert met rocky foothills. The house itself was plain, sturdy, built by his own hands 40 years earlier when he'd first brought his wife Margaret here as a young bride. The walls still held her touch. In small ways, the blue curtains she'd sewn, now faded by decades of sun. The wooden cross above the doorway she'd insisted on hanging their first night. The worn Bible on the kitchen table that had been hers. Margaret had been gone 17 years now. Cancer had taken her slowly, painfully, and Elijah had watched the woman he loved fade like morning mist under a merciless sun. In those final months, she'd made him promise not to give up on the land, not to let loneliness turn him bitter. He'd kept that promise, though some days it felt heavier than others. The house was too quiet without her laughter, without her humming while she cooked, without her gentle corrections when his stubbornness got the better of him. But he wasn't entirely alone. Clara had come into his life just weeks after Margaret passed, a gift from his neighbor Ramon Gutierrez, who'd seen how Elijah was drowning in grief. Ramon had shown up one morning with the donkey in tow, a young Jenny, grey and sturdy, with intelligent dark eyes and a calm temperament. "She needs a home, and you need company," Ramon had said simply. "Don't argue with me, viejo. Just take her." Elijah had named her Clara after his mother, a woman who'd possessed the same quiet strength and patient endurance he saw in the donkey's eyes. Over the years, Clara had become more than just a working animal. She was his companion, his confidant, the living creature who shared his days and seemed to understand his silences. She carried supplies when he checked fences, stood patiently while he worked, and followed him around the property like a devoted dog. In the evenings, he'd sit on his porch with a cup of coffee, and Clara would stand nearby, her presence a comfort against the vast emptiness of the desert night. The land itself was hard country, beautiful in its starkness but unforgiving to those who didn't respect it. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels across the rocky terrain, their arms raised in permanent benediction. Palo Verde trees provided sparse shade, their green bark bright against the rusty earth. In spring, if the winter rains had been good, the desert exploded with wildflowers, Mexican gold poppies, lupines, and brittlebush, turning the harsh landscape into something almost magical. But this was October, the dry season, when everything hunkered down and waited for relief that wouldn't come for months. Elijah's property bordered public land to the east, a vast expanse of desert and rocky hills where cattle sometimes wandered, and where, increasingly, trouble came from. The border with Mexico was only 30 miles south, and the area had become a corridor for drug smugglers and human traffickers. Border Patrol helicopters passed overhead regularly, and Elijah had found evidence of passage on his land: empty water bottles, discarded backpacks, disturbed fences. He didn't involve himself in it. He kept his head down, fixed what needed fixing, and minded his own business. At his age, a man learned that some troubles were best left to younger men with badges and authority. He'd spent the morning riding the fence line on the eastern edge of his property, Clara walking beside him carrying tools and wire in the panniers strapped to her back. The fence needed constant maintenance, cattle pushed against it, weather weakened it, and sometimes people cut it. He'd found 3 breaks that morning and spent hours in the climbing heat, repairing them, his weathered hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a lifetime's work. His body protested more these days. Arthritis made his fingers stiff in the mornings, his knees complained on cold days, and his back reminded him of every horse that had ever thrown him, every post he'd ever lifted. But he kept working. What else was there? His son lived in Phoenix with a family of his own, too busy with a career in real estate to visit more than twice a year. They talked on the phone every few weeks, dutiful conversations that never went very deep. His daughter had moved to Colorado, married a man Elijah had never quite warmed to, and their relationship had grown distant over the years. He had grandchildren he barely knew, children growing up in suburbs who thought of Arizona as a place you visited, not a place you belonged to. The distance hurt in ways he didn't talk about, a quiet ache he'd learned to live with like the pain in his joints. By early afternoon, he'd finished the repairs and decided to check a stock tank about 3 miles east, near the edge of his property. The tank collected rainwater and served as a watering hole for wildlife and the occasional stray cattle. He liked to keep it maintained, felt a responsibility to the animals that depended on it. Clara walked beside him, her hooves crunching on the gravelly soil, her long ears swiveling to catch sounds he could no longer hear. His hearing had faded over the years, another small theft of aging, and he relied on Clara's alertness to warn him of rattlesnakes or other dangers. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky, the temperature pushing toward 95 degrees despite the season. Elijah wore his battered Stetson, sweat-stained and shaped by decades of wear, its wide brim providing essential shade. His chambray shirt was faded nearly white, and his jeans were worn soft at the knees. He carried water in a canteen on his belt and a .38 revolver in a leather holster, not for people, but for rattlesnakes or the occasional rabid coyote. He'd lived long enough to know that the desert demanded respect and preparation. They were about half a mile from the stock tank when Clara stopped abruptly, her ears pinned forward, her body tense. Elijah paused, placing a hand on her neck. "What is it, girl?" he asked quietly. He'd learned to trust her instincts. She could sense things before they became visible, could smell water or danger or changes in weather that his dulled senses missed. Then he heard it, the sound of engines, multiple vehicles moving fast across rough terrain. His property was remote enough that vehicle traffic was rare, and something about the aggressive sound made him uneasy. He moved behind a large boulder, pulling Clara with him, and watched as 3 pickup trucks came into view about 200 yards away. They were moving across public land, parallel to his fence line, traveling fast and reckless, kicking up dust plumes. Elijah stayed still, hoping they'd pass without seeing him. But one of the trucks stopped abruptly, and men jumped out, 4 of them, armed with rifles. Even from a distance, Elijah could see they weren't hunters or border patrol. They moved with purpose, unloading something from the truck beds. His stomach tightened. Drugs, most likely. He'd stumbled onto a smuggling operation. The smart thing would have been to stay hidden, to wait until they left, then get home and call the sheriff. But one of the men turned and looked directly toward his position. Maybe sunlight had glinted off his canteen, or maybe Clara had shifted and caught their attention. Whatever the reason, the man shouted and pointed. Elijah didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and started moving back the way he'd come, leading Clara quickly but not running. Running would only confirm he'd seen something he shouldn't have. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline sharpening his senses. He heard shouts behind him, the sound of engines starting up. They were coming after him. He moved faster, his boots slipping on loose rock. Clara kept pace beside him, her breathing steady despite the heat. They needed to reach cover, needed to get back to thicker brush where the trucks couldn't follow easily. But the terrain was too open, the distance too great. He heard the vehicles getting closer, heard men shouting in Spanish. Then came the crack of a rifle shot, the sound echoing off the rocks. Elijah felt a burning impact in his left thigh, a sensation like being struck with a red-hot poker. His leg buckled and he went down hard, his hat flying off, pain exploding through his body. Clara stopped immediately, turning back to him with a sound he'd never heard, her make a braying call that seemed to hold both alarm and something like grief. More shots followed, kicking up dust around him, but Elijah had rolled behind a fallen mesquite log, his hands clutching his thigh, where blood was already soaking through his jeans. The pain was immense, stealing his breath, making his vision swim. He could hear the trucks getting closer, could hear men's voices conferring. They were deciding whether to finish the job or leave him to die in the desert. Clara stood exposed, 20 feet away, looking at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. "Get out of here." He tried to shout, but his voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "Go on, Clara, go home." But she didn't move. She just stood there, as if keeping vigil, as if refusing to abandon him even as death circled closer. The pain in Elijah's leg had shifted from sharp and burning to a deep, nauseating throb that pulsed with each beat of his heart. Blood continued to seep through his fingers where he pressed against the wound, warm and sticky. He could feel it pooling beneath him, soaking into the dry earth. The bullet had entered the outside of his left thigh, and from the amount of bleeding, he suspected it had hit the femoral artery or come close enough to damage major vessels. Without medical attention soon, he'd bleed out right here in the dirt. The trucks had stopped about 50 yards away. He could hear men talking, their voices carrying across the desert silence. They spoke in rapid Spanish, debating. One voice argued they should make sure the old man was dead. Another countered that he was as good as dead anyway, no phone, no help, and they had to move the product before Border Patrol showed up. The desert would finish what they'd started. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, the engines roared back to life. The trucks turned and headed east, back toward wherever they'd come from, leaving Elijah bleeding behind a log with the sun climbing higher and no rescue coming. The sound of the engines faded, replaced by the desert's usual soundtrack, the distant cry of a hawk, the rustle of wind through creosote bushes, his own ragged breathing. Clara approached slowly, carefully, as if she understood the gravity of what had happened. She came close enough that Elijah could reach out and touch her soft muzzle with his bloodied hand. "Good girl," he whispered. "Smart girl." Staying quiet. She'd stood there exposed, but she hadn't made a sound while the men deliberated. Some animals panicked in crisis. Clara had remained steady. Elijah tried to assess his situation with the clarity that came from 7 decades of facing hard realities. He was 3 miles from his house, maybe more. He'd lost a lot of blood already and was still losing it. His leg wouldn't bear weight. He'd tried to shift position and nearly blacked out from the pain. Even if he could crawl, 3 miles over rocky desert terrain would take hours he didn't have. The sun was past its zenith now, probably 2 or 3 in the afternoon. He had maybe 4 or 5 hours of daylight left, then the temperature would plummet. Desert nights in October could drop to 40 degrees, and in his weakened state, hypothermia would kill him as surely as blood loss. No one knew where he was. He'd mentioned to Ramon yesterday that he planned to check fences, but Ramon wouldn't worry if he didn't see Elijah for days. His son wouldn't expect a call until the weekend. The nearest neighbor besides Ramon was 6 miles away. People would eventually notice his absence, but eventually might be 3 or 4 days from now. He looked up at Clara, who stood patiently beside him, and something broke loose in his chest. Not panic, but a deep sadness. After everything he'd survived, all the years of work and grief and pushing forward, this was how it would end. Not peacefully in his sleep or surrounded by family, but bleeding out alone in the desert he'd called home his whole life. Margaret had been right to worry about him staying out here alone. He'd always told her he'd be fine, that he could take care of himself. Pride. That was all it had been. Foolish pride. "I'm sorry, girl," he said to Clara, his voice weak. You'll have to find your way. Home on your own. Ramon will take care of you. He's a good man." The thought of Clara wandering alone, confused by his absence, made his throat tighten. She'd been with him for 17 years. Every single day. She didn't understand death, wouldn't understand why he'd stopped coming. The donkey lowered her head and nuzzled his face, her breath warm and familiar, smelling of hay and desert dust. Her whiskers tickled his cheek. Then she did something that made him wonder if he was already delirious from blood loss. She stepped back a few paces and slowly, deliberately, folded her front legs and lowered herself to the ground beside him. Elijah stared at her, not comprehending at first. Clara had never been trained to lie down on command. Donkeys didn't generally do that. They were prey animals, and lying down made them vulnerable. She remained down for a moment, looking at him, then heaved herself back to her feet. Then she did it again, folding her legs, lowering her body, staying down for several seconds before rising. It took his pain-fogged mind a moment to understand what she was offering. She was showing him that she could kneel, that she could get low enough for him to potentially climb onto her back. But that was impossible. Clara was a working donkey, used to carrying packs and supplies, but she'd never been trained as a riding animal. She'd never had a saddle on her back, never had a person mounted. And even if she would tolerate it, how could he possibly get himself up there with a shattered leg and blood loss, making him weaker by the minute? But what other option did he have? Lie here and die, or try something that seemed impossible. "All right, girl," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All right. Let's try." He used the fallen log to pull himself to a sitting position, biting back a scream as his wounded leg shifted. Fresh blood soaked through his jeans. His vision grayed at the edges, and he had to wait for the wave of dizziness to pass. Clara watched him, then positioned herself close beside the log, as near as she could get. She lowered herself down again, folding her front legs first, then settling her hindquarters. Even with Clara lying down, getting onto her back seemed impossible. Elijah was a tall man, over 6 feet, and Clara stood only about 4 feet at the shoulder when upright. Lying down, her back was maybe 2.5 feet off the ground, but his injured leg was useless and his strength was fading fast. He'd have to somehow drag himself across her back, using only his arms and his good leg. He reached out and gripped her mane, coarse grey hair that had thickened for winter. "I'm going to hurt you," he told her. "I'm going to pull on you, and it's going to be uncomfortable, but I need you to stay still. Can you do that for me?" Clara remained motionless, her body steady as stone. Elijah pulled himself forward on his belly, ignoring the screaming protest of his leg, using the log as leverage. Inch by inch, he dragged himself closer until his chest was against her side. He could feel her breathing, could feel the solid warmth of her body. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just waited with a patience that seemed almost supernatural. Using every bit of remaining strength, he pulled himself up and across her back, his wounded leg dragging behind him. The pain was beyond anything he'd ever experienced, worse than the bullet impact, worse than any injury from his decades of ranch work. He had to stop twice, gasping, certain he would pass out. But Clara remained absolutely still, bearing his weight and his awkward movements without complaint. Finally, impossibly, he was draped across her back, his chest against her shoulders, his good leg hanging down one side and his wounded leg the other. He wrapped his arms around her neck, tangling his fingers in her mane. "Okay," he breathed into her ear. "Okay, I'm on. I'm on." Clara waited another moment, as if making absolutely certain he was secure. Then, slowly and carefully, she began to rise. First her hindquarters lifted, and Elijah had to grip with all his remaining strength to keep from sliding forward over her head. Then her front legs straightened, and he was suddenly 4 feet off the ground, clinging to a donkey who was carrying him like some kind of prayer-given form. She stood still for a long moment, adjusting to his weight, and Elijah adjusted too, trying to find a position that wouldn't slide him off. He ended up sitting astride her as best he could, hunched forward, his arms wrapped around her neck, his face pressed against her mane. His wounded legs screamed in protest at hanging down, but there was nothing to be done about it. Blood continued to run down into his boot. "Home," he whispered to her. "Take me home, Clara." And she did. Without hesitation, without guidance, Clara turned herself west toward home and began to walk. The journey that followed existed in Elijah's memory as a series of fragmented images and sensations strung together like beads on a broken string. Pain was the constant, the deep, grinding agony in his thigh that never stopped, that pulsed and burned and sometimes made him cry out despite himself. He tried to stay conscious, tried to remain aware of direction and distance, but his grip on consciousness kept slipping. Clara walked steadily, her gait smooth and measured. Donkeys had a different movement than horses, less bouncing, more of a swaying rhythm. Under other circumstances, it might have been comfortable. Now, every shift in her weight sent fresh waves of pain through his body. He clung to her neck, his face buried in her mane, trying to stay mounted. Several times he felt himself starting to slide to one side and had to force his weakening muscles to pull himself back to center. The sun beat down mercilessly. Without his hat, which still lay somewhere back by the log, his head was exposed to the full force of the Arizona sun. He could feel it burning the back of his neck, feel the heat building inside his skull. Thirst became another torment to add to the pain. His canteen was still on his belt, but he couldn't release his grip on Clara's neck long enough to reach it without falling off. Time lost meaning. He watched the shadows shift and knew hours were passing, but whether it had been 1 hour or 3, he couldn't say. Sometimes he was lucid, aware of the desert passing slowly by the familiar landmarks, the rocky outcrop shaped like a saddle horn, the old windmill visible in the distance. Other times he drifted away, and when awareness returned, he'd find they were somewhere else entirely, Clara still walking steadily beneath him. Once, he came back to himself and realized the sun was much lower in the sky, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. How long had he been unconscious? His grip on Clara's mane had loosened, and he was listing badly to the left. With tremendous effort, he pulled himself upright again. His hands were sticky with blood. His blood smeared all over Clara's neck and mane. She was painted with it, marked by his injury, but still she walked. "Good girl," he mumbled. "Good, Clara. Keep going." His mind wandered to Margaret. He could see her so clearly, standing on the porch of their house in the evening light, waiting for him to come in from work. She'd be smiling that particular smile she had, the one that said she knew him better than he knew himself. He'd been so lucky to have her, to have those 40-some years together. They'd had their troubles, money worries, the years when the ranch barely broke even, the heartbreak of 2 miscarriages before their son was born. But they'd had love, real and deep, the kind that got stronger with time instead of wearing thin. "I tried to keep my promise," he said aloud, though whether he was talking to Margaret or Clara, or just to the desert itself, he couldn't say. "I tried not to give up." The sun touched the sun. Horizon, flooding the world with that particular quality of light that only happened in the desert at day's end, golden and achingly beautiful. Elijah had seen thousands of sunsets in his life, but this one struck him as particularly precious, perhaps because he thought it might be his last. He watched the light paint the saguaros and turn the mountains purple in the distance. Then he slipped away again, consciousness abandoning him. When he came back, it was darker, not full night yet, but that deep blue twilight when the stars were just beginning to appear. He was still on Clara's back, though he couldn't remember the intervening time. His whole body felt numb, except for his leg, which continued to throb. He was so cold now, shivering despite the warmth still radiating from the earth. Shock, he thought distantly. Blood loss and shock. He tried to focus on where they were, and realized with a jolt of hope that he recognized this area. They were close, maybe a mile from his property, maybe less. In the fading light, he could make out the fence line and beyond it, terrain he knew like the lines of his own hand. Clara had brought them home, or near enough to home that help might actually be possible. "Keep going," he urged her, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Almost there, girl. Almost there." But even as he said it, he felt himself slipping again, the darkness pulling at him with insistent hands. He tried to fight it, knowing that if he fell off now, this close to safety, Clara wouldn't be able to get him back on. But he was so tired, had lost so much blood, and the darkness was seductive in its promise of relief from pain. The last thing he remembered clearly was Clara's steady walk, the rhythmic sway of her movement, and the first evening star appearing in the darkening sky above. Then the darkness took him completely, and he knew nothing at all. Elijah woke to pain and confusion. His first thought was that he'd fallen, that he was lying on the ground somewhere. But he could feel movement beneath him, could feel the warm solidity of Clara's body. Somehow he was still on her back, though he had no memory of staying there. His arms were still wrapped around her neck, his fingers locked in her mane in a death grip his unconscious mind had maintained even when awareness fled. It was full dark now, the desert night complete, except for the brilliant scatter of stars overhead and a crescent moon hanging low in the west. The temperature had dropped sharply. He could feel it in the air, could see his breath forming small clouds in front of his face when he exhaled. His whole body was shaking with cold, violent tremors that made his teeth chatter. But Clara was still walking, still carrying him through the night. How long had they been traveling? How far had she brought him? He tried to lift his head, to look around and get his bearings, but the effort sent fresh waves of dizziness washing over him. He settled for squinting into the darkness, trying to recognize shapes and shadows. Then he saw it, a light in the distance. Not the cold light of stars, but the warm yellow glow of electric lights. A building, a house. His heart lurched with hope, even as his mind struggled to make sense of it. They'd passed his house already, they must have. Clara had walked right past his property and kept going, heading toward the nearest neighbor, the Kendrick place. Tom and Susan Kendrick, retired school teachers who'd bought a small ranch 5 miles from Elijah's property about 10 years ago. Good people, friendly but respectful of boundaries. Elijah saw them maybe once every few months, when their paths crossed in town or when Tom needed to borrow a tool. The Kendricks would have a phone. They could call for help. Clara seemed to sense they were close to the end of their journey. Her pace picked up slightly, her ears forward and alert. Elijah clung to consciousness through sheer force of will, watching as the lights grew closer. He could make out the shape of the house now, a modern ranch-style home with a wide porch and motion sensor lights that suddenly blazed on as Clara approached. The front door opened, spilling more light across the yard. Tom Kendrick stepped out onto the porch, probably drawn by the motion sensors. He was in his 60s, a solid man with grey hair and glasses that caught the light. He looked toward the yard, probably expecting to see a coyote or deer that had triggered the sensors. Instead, he saw a blood-covered donkey with a man slumped across her back, barely conscious, emerging from the darkness like something from a fever dream. "Susan!" Tom's shout was loud enough to reach even Elijah's fading hearing. "Susan, call 911, now!" Tom ran down the porch steps, moving faster than Elijah would have thought possible for a man his age. Clara stopped in the yard, her legs trembling now, the first sign of exhaustion she'd shown through the entire ordeal. Tom reached them, his face shocked and pale in the harsh light. "Elijah? My God! Elijah, what happened?" Elijah tried to answer, tried to explain about the men and the trucks and the shooting, but all that came out was a mumbled string of words that might not have made any sense. His fingers were still locked in Clara's mane, and Tom had to gently pry them loose. "I've got you," Tom said. "I've got you. Susan's calling for help. Just hold on." Susan appeared in the doorway, phone pressed to her ear, her face tight with fear. "They're coming," she called out. "Ambulance and sheriff. They're coming." Tom tried to ease Elijah down from Clara's back. But the movement sent such an explosion of pain through Elijah's leg that he cried out, a sound he barely recognized as his own voice. Together, Tom and Susan managed to get him down and half-carried, half-dragged him onto the porch. Susan ran inside and came back with blankets, and they wrapped him up, trying to warm his shaking body. "You're going to be okay," Tom kept saying, though his voice was tight with uncertainty. "Help is coming. You're going to be okay." Elijah's vision was dimming again, the edges going dark. But before he slipped away, he looked past Tom and Susan to where Clara stood in the yard. The motion lights illuminated her clearly grey coat, matted with sweat and blood, her head lowered with exhaustion, her legs splayed slightly as if she could barely stand. But her eyes were on him, those dark, intelligent eyes, watching to make sure he was being cared for. "Clara," he whispered. "Someone needs to take care of Clara." "We will," Susan said, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll take care of her. I promise." Satisfied, Elijah let the darkness take him again. This time it felt different, not the pulling sensation of blood loss dragging him under, but more like falling into a deep, exhausted sleep. Somewhere far away he heard sirens approaching. Closer he heard Susan's voice, soft and reassuring, and Tom's steady presence beside him. And beneath it all, he heard the sound of Clara's breathing, the faithful companion who had refused to let him die alone in the desert. The world faded to nothing, but this time Elijah wasn't afraid. He'd been found, he'd been saved, and Clara, his Clara, was being cared for. The next time awareness returned, it came slowly and in pieces. First, there was the steady beeping of a monitor, a sound that pulled at him like a thread, drawing him up from deep water. Then came the sensation of softness beneath him, a mattress, clean sheets, the particular comfort of a real bed after lying on hard ground. Pain was there too, but muted now, held at bay by something that made his thoughts fuzzy and his tongue thick. He tried to open his eyes and found them heavy, resistant. When he finally managed it, harsh fluorescent light made him squint, white ceiling tiles, the antiseptic smell of hospital, more beeping, and the soft whoosh of something. Mechanical, a blood pressure cuff inflating around his arm. He's waking up. A woman's voice, professional and calm. A nurse, probably. "Mr. Brand, can you hear me?" Elijah tried to respond, but his throat was too dry. He managed a sound that might have been, "Yes. Don't try to talk yet. Let me get you some water." The nurse moved into his field of vision, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and greying hair pulled back in a ponytail. She held a cup with a straw to his lips, and he drank gratefully, the water soothing his parched throat. "Where?" His voice came out as a croak. He tried again. "Where am I?" "Tucson Medical Center. You were airlifted in last night. Do you remember what happened?" "Last night. The shooting, the bleeding, Clara carrying him through the desert." It came back in a rush, and he tried to sit up, but pain and weakness and the nurse's gentle hand on his shoulder kept him flat. "My donkey," he said urgently. "Clara, where? Your donkey is fine," the nurse assured him. "Your neighbors are taking care of her. Everyone's been talking about what she did, Mr. Brand. She saved your life." The relief was so intense it made his eyes sting. Clara was safe. She was being cared for. That was what mattered most. "Your son is here," the nurse continued. "He's been waiting all night. Let me get the doctor first, then we'll let him in. You've had surgery, and the doctor will want to talk to you about it." Surgery? His leg? Elijah looked down at his body beneath the thin hospital blanket. His left leg was heavily bandaged, elevated slightly. He could feel the dull throb of it, even through the pain medication. The doctor arrived a few minutes later, a young woman who looked far too young to be cutting people open, but who spoke with the confidence of competence. "Dr. Patel," she introduced herself. She explained that he'd been shot in the upper thigh, that the bullet had fractured his femur and caused significant vascular damage. They'd operated to repair the artery, remove the bullet fragments, and stabilize the fracture with a rod. "You lost a lot of blood," Dr. Patel said. If your neighbor hadn't gotten you here when they did, you wouldn't have made it. As it is, you're going to need extensive physical therapy, and there's some concern about nerve damage. But Mr. Brand, the fact that you survived at all is remarkable. Most people who sustain that kind of injury in a remote location don't make it. Clara did that, Elijah said. My donkey. She carried me miles. Dr. Patel smiled. So I've heard. The paramedics said she was standing guard over you when they arrived. Wouldn't let them near you at first until your neighbor convinced her you were being helped. She checked his chart, made some notes. The sheriff wants to talk to you when you're feeling up to it. Something about a shooting. The sheriff. Right. The men with the trucks, the drugs, or whatever they'd been moving. Elijah's testimony might help catch them, though he doubted he could identify any of them from that distance. Still, he'd tell what he saw, do his duty as a witness. After the doctor left, his son came in. David Brand, 45 years old, wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt that still had creases from being packed in a suitcase. His face was drawn with worry and lack of sleep, and when he saw Elijah awake, his expression crumpled with relief. "Dad," David's voice cracked. He came to the bedside, seemed unsure whether to hug his father or not, and settled for gripping his hand. "God, Dad. When they called, I thought..." He couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm okay," Elijah said, though okay was a relative term. "I'm alive. They said you rode a donkey for miles with a gunshot wound. Is that true?" "Clara carried me. I don't know if rode is the right word. Mostly I just held on." David shook his head, still processing. "I can't believe it. A donkey. Your donkey saved your life." They talked for a while, David, filling him in on details Elijah had missed. The sheriff's department had indeed been looking for a smuggling operation in that area. Elijah's description of the trucks and the approximate location would help them narrow their search. The Kendricks had stayed at the hospital most of the night, only leaving when David arrived. Clara was at the Kendrick place, being pampered with extra feed and a warm stall. "Dad," David said after a pause, his tone shifting to something more serious. "This can't keep happening. You can't keep living out there alone. What if this happens again? What if you fall or have a medical emergency? There's no one around to help you." Elijah had known this conversation was coming. He'd been having versions of it with David for years, the gentle but persistent suggestions that he sell the property, move to Phoenix, live in a retirement community where there were people around. David meant well, Elijah knew that, but the thought of leaving his land, of spending his remaining years in some apartment complex playing shuffleboard, made something in his chest tighten with resistance. "I'll think about it," he said, which was what he always said. It bought him time, kept the peace. David didn't look satisfied, but he didn't push. Not now. Not when his father was lying in a hospital bed with a shattered leg. But Elijah knew the conversation wasn't over. It was just delayed. Over the next few days, as Elijah slowly recovered strength, the story of his rescue spread. The nurses all knew about Clara, and visitors, the sheriff, the Kendricks, even Ramon, who drove 2 hours from his new place in Nogales, all wanted to hear the details. How had the donkey known to kneel? Had she been trained for that? Was it instinct or intelligence or something else? Elijah couldn't answer those questions. He only knew that when he'd needed her most, Clara had understood somehow and had done something extraordinary. Donkeys were smart animals, loyal and clever, but what Clara had done seemed to transcend normal animal behavior. It felt like something more, a bond forged over 17 years of shared grief and daily companionship, a connection deep enough that she'd known what he needed even when he couldn't ask for it. The sheriff came by on the 3rd day, a weathered man named Martinez, who'd been in law enforcement for 30 years. He took Elijah's statement carefully, recording every detail about the trucks, the men, the location. Martinez told him they'd found evidence of the smuggling operation and had made several arrests. The men who'd shot him were still at large, but they had leads. "You're lucky to be alive," Martinez said bluntly. "Those guys don't usually leave witnesses." "They thought I'd die out there," Elijah replied. Probably would have if not for Clara. Martinez nodded slowly. I've been doing this job long enough to see some strange things, but a donkey carrying a man miles through the desert to safety? That's a new one. He closed his notebook. Your donkey should get a medal or something. After Martinez left, Elijah lay in bed watching the afternoon light slant through the window. The pain in his leg was constant but manageable with medication. The doctor said he'd be in the hospital another week at least, then would need rehabilitation before he could go home. Months of recovery stretched ahead of him, learning to walk again, regaining strength, rebuilding his life around new limitations. But he was alive. Against all odds, despite the bullet and the blood loss and the miles of desert between him and help, he was alive, and he owed that life to a grey donkey who'd refused to leave him behind. The thought made him wonder about connection, about the bonds we form with other creatures. He'd spent 17 years with Clara, and in that time, she'd become more than just an animal he owned. She'd become family in a way that was hard to explain to people who'd never experienced it. She'd filled some of the terrible emptiness Margaret's death had left behind. She'd given him a reason to get up each morning, someone to talk to even if she couldn't talk back, a living presence that made the lonely desert ranch feel less desolate. And when it mattered most, she'd saved him, not because she was trained to, not because she expected a reward, but simply because what? Love? Loyalty? Did donkeys feel such things? Elijah believed they did. He'd seen it in Clara's eyes, in the way she'd stood vigil over him, in her determination to carry him to safety, no matter how far she had to walk. That evening, David came back with his wife Jennifer, who Elijah saw only rarely. She was pleasant but distant, clearly uncomfortable in the hospital setting, and she left after 20 minutes, claiming she needed to check on the kids via phone. David stayed, and they talked about small things, David's work, the grandchildren Elijah barely knew, the weather in Phoenix. Finally, David brought up what had clearly been on his mind. Dad, I've been thinking, once you're recovered enough, why don't you come stay with us for a while, just until you're fully healed? The house has plenty of room, and we could make sure you're eating right, doing your physical therapy, all of that. Elijah appreciated the offer. He truly did. But the thought of being in David's modern suburban house, surrounded by the noise and bustle of a family life he wasn't part of, felt suffocating. I appreciate it, son, but I'll be better off at home, in my own space. But Dad, you can't take care of yourself out there, not for months. You'll need help. I'll hire someone if I need to. Or, Ramon's daughter lives in Tucson. She might be willing to check on me regularly. David's frustration was evident in the tight line of his jaw. This isn't just about right now. It's about the long term. You're 72 years old. You got shot. You almost died. Doesn't that tell you something about the risk you're taking living out there alone? It tells me I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, Elijah said quietly. Could have happened anywhere. But if it happened in Phoenix, in a neighborhood, someone would have found you immediately. You wouldn't have had to ride a donkey miles through the desert hoping you didn't die before you got help. Elijah looked at his son, his successful, well-meaning son, who'd built a good life in the city, who couldn't understand why anyone would choose the isolation and hardship of desert ranch life. There was a gulf between them that had been growing for years, a fundamental difference in how they saw the world and what they valued. David, Elijah said carefully, I know you're worried about me. I know you want me safe and close by. But that land, that house, that's where I built a life with your mother. That's where I've lived for 40 years. I'm not ready to leave it. I might never be ready. Even if staying there kills you, we all die somewhere, son. I'd rather it be on my own land than in some sterile apartment where I don't know my neighbors and there's nothing familiar around me. They left it there, the disagreement unresolved. David departed shortly after, his goodbye stiff with frustration and worry. Elijah felt the familiar ache of distance between them, wished he could bridge it somehow, but didn't know how to be someone other than who he was. That night, Elijah lay awake thinking about Clara. He wondered if she understood where he was, if she wondered why he hadn't come back for her. The Kendricks would treat her well, he trusted that, but Clara was his companion, and he was hers. They belonged together. The thought of her waiting for him, of her confusion at his absence, made his chest tight. She'd saved his life, had walked miles carrying him to safety, and now she was being cared for by strangers while he lay in a hospital bed. It didn't seem right. It didn't seem fair to her. "I'm coming back," he whispered to the dark hospital room. "I'm coming back, Clara, I promise." And he meant it. Whatever recovery lay ahead, whatever difficulties he'd have to overcome, he would get back to his land and his donkey. Because Clara had refused to abandon him in the desert, and he wouldn't abandon her either. They'd see each other through this, the way they'd seen each other through 17 years of grief and work and quiet companionship. Outside his window, the city lights of Tucson glowed against the night sky, blocking out the stars he was used to seeing from his porch. But if he closed his eyes, he could picture the desert at night, the vast darkness, the brilliant stars, the silhouette of saguaros against the moonlit sky. And in his mind he could see Clara standing in her corral, ears forward, waiting for the sound of his footsteps coming home. He would get back to her. Whatever it took, however long it required, he would heal, and he would go home. Because that's what you did for the ones you loved. You fought your way back to them, no matter the obstacles. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of Elijah's life, and he'd lived through plenty of hard times. The physical therapy was brutal, learning to put weight on his shattered leg again, fighting through pain that made him break out in cold sweats, forcing his body to remember how to walk when everything in him wanted to just stay still. The rod in his femur was a constant presence he could feel with every movement, a reminder of how close he'd come to dying in the desert. But harder than the physical pain was the battle against his own limitations. Elijah had always been independent, had always taken pride in doing things himself. Now he needed help with basic tasks, getting dressed, bathing, moving from bed to wheelchair. The nurses were kind but briskly efficient, and he hated being dependent on them. He hated the loss of dignity, hated feeling weak and helpless. Dr. Patel was cautiously optimistic about his recovery, but realistic about the challenges. "You'll walk again," she told him during one of her daily rounds. "But it's going to take time, and you'll probably always have some degree of limitation. At your age, bones heal more slowly, and the nerve damage complicates things." "How long?" Elijah asked bluntly. "Before you can go home? At least another week here, then probably 6 weeks in a rehabilitation facility. After that, you'll still need assistance at home for several months." Several months! The timeline stretched ahead of him like a prison sentence. Meanwhile, Clara was at the Kendricks' place, waiting for him. He called Tom Kendrick every few days to check on her, and Tom always reassured him that she was fine, eating well, seemed healthy. But Tom also mentioned that Clara spent a lot of time standing at the fence line, facing east toward home. "She's waiting for you," Tom said gently. Animals know. They remember. The thought of Clara, waiting, not understanding why he hadn't come back, was almost worse than the pain in his leg. It ate at him during the long hospital nights, when sleep wouldn't come, when he'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything that had happened. David visited twice more, and each time the conversation circled back to the same argument. Sell the property, move to Phoenix, accept help, let go of the past, and embrace a safer, more practical future. Elijah listened patiently but remained unmoved. His stubbornness, he knew, frustrated David immensely. But it wasn't just stubbornness, it was something deeper, a bone-deep certainty that leaving his land would be a kind of death in itself. On his 10th day in the hospital, Elijah had an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Martinez came by, not on official business this time, but as what he called a courtesy call. He pulled up a chair beside Elijah's bed, his weathered face serious. "We got them," Martinez said without preamble. "The men who shot you. 3 of them crossed back into Mexico, but we got the 4th one, guy named Hector Ruiz. He's talking, giving us information about the operation. Elijah absorbed this news silently. He felt no particular sense of satisfaction or revenge, just a tired acceptance that justice, such as it was, would be served. He said something interesting when we questioned him, Martinez continued. Said they debated whether to finish you off or leave you. The leader decided you'd die anyway, that it wasn't worth the extra time or the noise. They figured if anyone found you at all, it'd be days later. Martinez leaned back in his chair. What they didn't count on was Clara. No, Elijah agreed quietly. I don't suppose they did. Ruiz is being charged with attempted murder, drug trafficking, and a bunch of other felonies. He's looking at serious prison time. Thought you'd want to know. After Martinez left, Elijah sat quietly processing the information. The men who'd shot him would face consequences. The smuggling operation had been disrupted. In the grand scheme of things, justice was being served. But none of it changed the fundamental reality: he'd nearly died, and only Clara's extraordinary action had saved him. The story had apparently spread beyond the hospital. A local television news crew wanted to interview him about his rescue. The hospital's public relations department kept leaving messages, asking if he'd be willing to talk to reporters. There was even talk of some kind of award or recognition for Clara. Elijah declined it all. What had happened between him and Clara didn't need to be turned into a spectacle. It was personal, private, sacred in its own way. By the end of his second week in the hospital, Elijah had graduated from wheelchair to walker. He could stand on his own, though it hurt, and take a few shuffling steps before exhaustion and pain forced him to stop. The physical therapist, a cheerful woman named Rosa who reminded him of Margaret in her determined optimism, pushed him hard but knew when to back off. "You're doing better than expected," Rosa told him after a particularly grueling session. "Most people your age who've sustained this kind of injury take much longer to get mobile. You're motivated." Motivated was one word for it. Desperate was another. Every day in the hospital was a day away from Clara, a day of her waiting and not understanding. That desperation drove him to work harder, to push through pain that might have stopped someone with less reason to heal. Finally, Dr. Patel agreed to transfer him to a rehabilitation facility, a place that specialized in helping patients recover from major injuries before they could return home. It was progress, getting out of the hospital, but it still wasn't home. The facility was nice enough, as these places went. Private room, regular therapy sessions, decent food. But it felt institutional in a way that made Elijah's skin crawl. He'd never been good. With confinement, had always needed space and sky, and the freedom to move on his own terms. David came to visit on Elijah's first day at the rehab facility, and the strain between them was evident from the moment he walked in. They made small talk for a while, David updating him on the grandchildren's activities, Elijah sharing details about his therapy progress. But eventually, the conversation turned to the inevitable topic. "I've been thinking about your property," David said carefully. "I contacted a real estate agent just to get a sense of what it might be worth. The land alone, even without much water rights, could sell for a decent amount. Enough to set you up comfortably in Phoenix, maybe even in an assisted living place that's actually nice." Elijah's hands tightened on the arms of his wheelchair. "I didn't ask you to do that. I know, but Dad, we need to be realistic. Even if you recover enough to go home, you can't manage that property alone anymore. Not with your leg. Not at your age. What if something else happens? What if you fall, or there's another medical emergency? Then I'll deal with it when it happens. That's not a plan, Dad. That's just stubbornness." "Maybe it is," Elijah said, his voice hardening. "But it's my stubbornness, and my life, and my decision to make." David's frustration boiled over. "Do you have any idea how scared I was when I got that call? When they told me you'd been shot and might not make it, I thought I was going to lose you. And now you're telling me you want to go right back to the same isolated place where you nearly died? I nearly died because some criminals shot me, not because I was living on my own land. That could have happened anywhere. But it didn't happen anywhere. It happened there, miles from help, with nobody around. If your donkey hadn't saved you, David's voice cracked, if Clara hadn't done what she did, you'd be dead. Do you understand that? Dead, because you're too stubborn to. Accept that you can't do everything alone anymore. The words hung in the air between them, harsh and true. Elijah looked at his son and saw genuine fear there, genuine love beneath the anger. David had nearly lost his father, and that trauma was driving his insistence on change. Elijah understood that, respected it even, but understanding didn't change how he felt. "Son," Elijah said quietly, "I know you're scared. I know you want to protect me, but I can't live my life based on fear of what might happen. I survived. I'm here. And when I'm healed enough, I'm going home. Even if it kills you next time? Even then. Because that's my home, David. That's where I belong." They ended the visit on tense terms, David leaving with barely a goodbye, his shoulders tight with anger and worry. Elijah watched him go and felt the familiar ache of their disconnect. He wished he could be the father. David wanted compliant, practical, willing to make the safe choice, but he'd never been that person, and at 72, he wasn't about to start. That night, Elijah lay in his rehab facility bed and thought about what home meant. It wasn't just a building or a piece of land. It was the place where you'd lived your life, where every rock and tree held memories, where the ghosts of people you'd loved still walked beside you in the evening. It was the porch where he and Margaret had sat watching sunsets for 40 years. It was the corral where Clara waited each morning for her breakfast. It was the bedroom where his children had been born, the kitchen where his wife had cooked countless meals, the land he'd worked until his hands were calloused and his back was bent. Leaving all that would be like cutting off a part of himself. David didn't understand, because he'd left years ago, had built a life elsewhere, and saw this place through the lens of an outsider. But for Elijah, leaving would be a kind of dying, a surrender of everything that made him who he was. Over the following weeks, Elijah worked harder at physical therapy than he'd worked at anything in years. He pushed himself through pain, forced his damaged leg to bear weight, learned to walk with a cane, and eventually without one. Progress was slow and frustrating, but it was progress. Rosa marveled at his determination, told him he was recovering faster than expected. What she didn't know was that every small improvement, every step forward, was bringing him closer to Clara. That was the fuel that drove him, not abstract goals about maintaining independence or proving something to his son, but the simple, powerful need to get back to the donkey who'd saved his life. Tom Kendrick called regularly with updates. Clara was fine, healthy, eating well. But Tom also mentioned that she'd become increasingly withdrawn, standing for hours at the fence facing east, occasionally braying as if calling for someone. "She misses you," Tom said. "It's clear as day. Animals grieve, you know. They feel loss just like we do." The thought of Clara grieving for him, believing perhaps that he'd abandoned her, was almost unbearable. It made him work even harder, push even more, determined to shorten the timeline of their separation. 6 weeks after the shooting, Dr. Patel came to evaluate his progress. She examined his leg, watched him walk, reviewed his therapy notes. Her expression was professionally neutral, but Elijah thought he detected a hint of approval. "You've exceeded expectations," she said finally. "The bone is healing well, and you've regained more mobility than I anticipated at this stage. You're still going to need ongoing therapy, and you'll probably always have some limitation, arthritis, possibly chronic pain. But Mr. Brand, you're doing remarkably well for someone who sustained this level of trauma. Can I go home?" Elijah asked bluntly. Dr. Patel hesitated. "Medically, you could be discharged to home care within a week or 2. But I have concerns about you. Living alone in a remote location, you'd need someone checking on you regularly, help with certain tasks, ongoing physical therapy. I can arrange all that. Mr. Brand, I need to be clear with you. If you fall, if you have complications, if anything goes wrong out there, getting help quickly could be the difference between a setback and a disaster. Are you prepared for that risk?" "I am," Elijah said without hesitation. Dr. Patel studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, we'll start working on a discharge plan. But I want you to have a medical alert system, regular check-ins with home health services, and a commitment to continuing therapy. And if at any point your condition deteriorates, you need to promise me you'll accept additional help or consider a different living situation." "I promise," Elijah said, though he wasn't entirely sure he meant it. He'd make whatever promises necessary to get home. The news should have brought pure relief, but instead, it triggered a new wave of anxiety. Going home meant facing all the challenges that David had warned about: managing the property with limited mobility, handling daily tasks that used to be easy, accepting his new limitations. It meant confronting the reality that his life would never quite be the same as it had been before that bullet tore through his leg. But it also meant seeing Clara again, and that, more than anything else, made it all worthwhile. The day of his discharge arrived with Arizona autumn in full swing, cooler temperatures, clear skies, and a quality of light that made the desert look like it was painted in watercolors. David had wanted to be there, but Elijah had insisted he didn't need help. Instead, Tom Kendrick offered to drive him home, and Elijah gratefully accepted. Tom arrived at the rehab facility mid-morning, his pickup truck freshly washed for the occasion. He helped Elijah gather his few belongings, some clothes David had brought, his wallet and keys, recovered from the desert, and a folder full of medical instructions and therapy exercises. Elijah moved slowly, leaning on his cane, but he moved under his own power. The drive from Tucson back to his property took almost 2 hours. Elijah watched the landscape change as they left the city behind suburbs, giving way to open desert, the saguaros becoming more numerous, the mountains rising purple and stark against the horizon. Everything looked exactly as he remembered, yet somehow different too, as if the world had shifted slightly while he'd been gone. Tom made small talk for the first hour, then seemed to sense that Elijah needed quiet to process his homecoming. They drove in companionable silence, the radio playing soft country music, the sun warming the truck's interior. Elijah felt his chest tighten with emotion as familiar landmarks appeared: the old windmill that marked the eastern edge of his property, the distinctive rock formation shaped like a crouching cat, the dirt road that led to his house. Finally, Tom turned onto Elijah's driveway. The house appeared ahead, small and weathered and perfect. Elijah's eyes stung with unexpected tears. He'd wondered, during the darkest moments in the hospital, if he'd ever see this place again. Now here it was, exactly as he'd left it: the blue curtains in the window, the porch where he'd spent countless evenings, the corrals and outbuildings beyond. And standing at the corral fence, ears forward and alert, was Clara. Tom stopped the truck, and Elijah climbed out slowly, his movements stiff and careful. Clara saw him and immediately began braying, a sound of recognition and joy, and something that might have been relief. She paced along the fence line, her movements agitated, clearly wanting to get to him. "Let her out," Elijah said to Tom. "Please." Tom went to the corral gate and opened it. Clara didn't need any encouragement. She trotted straight to Elijah, her hooves kicking up small clouds of dust. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could feel her breath, and touched her muzzle to his chest. Elijah dropped his cane and wrapped both arms around Clara's neck, burying his face in her mane. She smelled of hay and dust and donkey, familiar and beloved, and he realized he was crying deep, shaking sobs that came from a place of profound relief and gratitude. Clara stood perfectly still, as if she understood that he needed this moment, needed to hold on to her and remember that they'd both survived. "Thank you," Elijah whispered into her mane. "Thank you, girl. Thank you for saving me." Clara made a soft sound, something between a nicker and a sigh, and pressed her head against his shoulder. They stood like that for several long minutes, man and donkey reunited, while Tom watched from a respectful distance, and the desert wind blew gentle and warm around them. Finally, Elijah pulled back and looked into Clara's dark eyes. She looked good, well-fed, healthy, her coat glossy from the Kendricks' care, but there was something in her expression that seemed like relief, as if she too had been waiting and worrying and wondering when he'd return. "I'm home," he told her. "I'm home now, and I'm not leaving you again." Tom helped him into the house, carrying his belongings and making sure everything was in order. The interior was exactly as Elijah had left it, dishes in the drainer, his coffee cup still on the table, Margaret's Bible in its usual spot. But there was also dust on every surface, and a musty smell that spoke of weeks of emptiness. Tom had been checking on the place regularly, making sure pipes didn't freeze and nothing was broken, but it still felt abandoned in the way houses do when no one's living in them. "I stocked your refrigerator and pantry," Tom said, showing him the fresh supplies in the kitchen. "Susan's been cooking extra, and she'll bring meals over a few times a week. We've arranged for a home health nurse to come by 3 times a week to check on you and help with therapy. And I'll be stopping by daily, at least for the first few weeks." "You don't have to do all that," Elijah protested, though he was grateful beyond words. "Yes, we do," Tom said firmly. "Clara saved your life, and now we're going to help make sure you can stay here and take care of her." "That seems like a fair trade." After Tom left, Elijah stood on his porch and looked out at his land. Everything was as it should be: the corrals, the outbuildings, the desert stretching away to the mountains. Clara grazed nearby, never straying far from where he stood. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting everything in golden light. He'd made it home. Against all odds, despite the bullet and the blood loss and the weeks of painful recovery, he was standing on his own porch, breathing desert air, watching his donkey graze in the evening light. It felt like a miracle, or maybe just the result of one animal's extraordinary loyalty and determination. Elijah sat down carefully in his porch chair, the same chair where he'd sat thousands of evenings before, where he and Margaret had watched sunsets together, where he'd grieved her loss and learned to live with loneliness. But tonight, loneliness felt a little less heavy. Clara was here, solid and real and alive. They'd both survived, had both made it through something that could have ended very differently. As the sun touched the horizon, Clara stopped grazing and walked over to the porch. She stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at him with those intelligent, patient eyes. Elijah reached down and scratched behind her ears, feeling the softness of her coat, the warmth of her living body. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" he said softly. "2 old survivors, 2 stubborn to quit." Clara's ears swiveled toward him, listening. In the fading light, with the desert painted in shades of amber and rust, Elijah felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where he belonged. The road ahead would be difficult. His recovery was far from complete, and managing the property with his limitations would require adjustments he'd never wanted to make. But he was home, and Clara was with him. And for now, that was enough. The weeks that followed settled into a new routine, one dictated by Elijah's slowly healing body and the necessary acceptance of help that went against his every instinct. The home health nurse, a competent woman named Patricia, came by 3 times a week to check his wound, monitor his progress, and guide him through therapy exercises. Tom Kendrick stopped by daily, sometimes just for a few minutes to make sure Elijah was okay, other times staying longer to help with tasks that required more mobility than Elijah currently possessed. Susan Kendrick brought meals in ceramic dishes that Elijah would later wash, and return casseroles, soups, roasted chicken with vegetables, homemade bread. The food was good, though it made him feel like an invalid in a way that chafed at his pride. He tried to refuse at first, insisting he could cook for himself, but Susan had simply smiled and left the dishes anyway. Eventually, he stopped protesting and just accepted the kindness, though it didn't come easy. His son David called every few days, conversations that walked a careful line between genuine concern and barely concealed frustration. David would ask about his therapy, about whether he was eating properly, about his pain levels. Then he'd mention, casually, that the offer still stood. Elijah could come to Phoenix any time, could sell the property, could accept that maybe living alone in the desert wasn't practical anymore. Elijah deflected these suggestions with the same patient stubbornness he'd always employed. "I'm doing fine, son. Healing up good. Don't worry so much." The conversations always ended with a tension neither of them quite knew how to resolve. A love, stretched thin across incompatible visions of what Elijah's life should look like. But the real routine, the one that mattered most, was built around Clara. Every morning, Elijah would make his slow way out to the corral to feed her. The walk that used to take 30 seconds now took several minutes, his cane supporting weight his legs still couldn't fully bear. Clara would be waiting at the fence, greeting him with soft sounds and gentle nudges, her presence a constant reminder of what they'd been through together. He'd brush her coat, talking to her about nothing and everything, about the weather, about memories of Margaret, about the frustration of being unable to do simple tasks without pain. Clara would stand patiently through it all, her ears swiveling to catch his voice, occasionally turning her head to look at him as if she understood every word. The brushing sessions became a kind of therapy in themselves, as important as the exercises Patricia put him through. The rhythmic motion soothed something in Elijah's spirit, and Clara's calm presence grounded him when frustration or pain threatened to overwhelm his determination. They'd survived something together, had forged a bond in that desert walk that transcended the normal relationship between human and animal. Sometimes neighbors would stop by, drawn by the story that had spread throughout the small community. They'd want to see Clara, to meet the donkey who'd saved a man's life. Elijah tolerated these visits, though he didn't particularly enjoy them. People would ask the same questions. How had Clara known what to do? Had she been trained? Was it instinct or intelligence? Elijah would give the same answers. He didn't know. She'd never been trained for it. It was simply something that had happened. What he didn't tell them was that late at night, when his leg throbbed too much for sleep and he'd sit on his porch in the darkness, he sometimes wondered if there had been something more to it. Some connection between him and Clara that went deeper than training or instinct, something almost mystical in how she'd known exactly what he needed. He didn't have words for it, didn't know how to explain it even to himself, but he felt it a bond that death had tested and failed to break. Ramon Gutierrez made the drive from Nogales one weekend, arriving unannounced with groceries and a bottle of tequila. They sat on the porch as the sun set, Ramon smoking a cigarette and Elijah nursing a small glass of the tequila, the first alcohol he'd had since before the shooting. "You look like hell, viejo," Ramon said with his typical bluntness. "Feel like it too," Elijah admitted. "But I'm getting better." Ramon took a drag on his cigarette, his weathered face contemplative. "You know, when I gave you Clara all those years ago, I thought she'd be company for you, keep you from getting too lonely after Margaret passed. Never imagined she'd save your life. Neither did I. Makes a man think, doesn't it? About what animals know, what they understand." Ramon flicked ash into the dirt. "My grandmother used to say, animals can sense things we can't. Said they see into people's hearts, know things about souls and spirits that we've forgotten." Elijah sipped his tequila, feeling it burn pleasantly down his throat. "Your grandmother was a wise woman. She was, and she'd say what Clara did was no accident. She'd say that Donkey knew you, knew your heart, and wouldn't let you die out there because there was still a bond that needed honoring." They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching night settle over the desert. When Ramon left, he gripped Elijah's shoulder hard. "You're a stubborn bastard, you know that? But I'm glad you're alive. This place wouldn't be right without you in it." The therapy was grueling. Patricia pushed him hard, insisting he work through pain that sometimes made him break out in cold sweats. She'd have him do leg lifts, weight-bearing, exercises, walking with and without his cane. Progress was maddeningly slow. Some days he'd feel stronger, other days his leg would barely support him. The inconsistency frustrated him, made him wonder if he'd ever fully recover. "You're doing well," Patricia would insist when he complained. "You're 72 years old with a severely traumatic injury. The fact that you're walking at all is remarkable. Give yourself credit for that." But credit didn't interest Elijah. Results did. He wanted to be able to walk his fence line again, to do his own work, to not need help with basic tasks. Every limitation reminded him of what he'd lost, of how the shooting had stolen part of his independence. One afternoon, about 2 months after he'd come home, Elijah decided to try walking out to the stock tank where he'd been shot. It was probably foolish. The distance was over 3 miles round trip, and he'd barely managed to walk half a mile without exhaustion. But something in him needed to see the place again, needed to confront the sight of his near death. He started early in the morning when it was cool, taking Clara with him. She walked beside him, matching her pace to his slow progress, occasionally pausing to graze, but never straying far. His leg protested from the first steps, and by the time he'd covered half a mile, he was leaning heavily on his cane and wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. But he pushed on, stubborn and determined. Clara walked beside him, her presence encouraging. They stopped frequently so he could rest, sitting on rocks or fallen logs while his leg throbbed and his breathing settled. The journey that he used to make without thinking now required every bit of willpower he possessed. It took over 2 hours to reach the stock tank. When they arrived, Elijah stood looking at the landscape, trying to remember exactly where he'd fallen. The desert had erased most evidence of what had happened. Wind and time had scattered the disturbed soil, and the blood that had soaked into the earth was long gone. But he found the mesquite log he'd sheltered behind, and near it, almost hidden in the brush, his battered Stetson. He picked up the hat, turning it over in his hands. It was sun-faded and dusty, with a dark stain on the inner band that he knew was his own blood. The hat had been on his head when he'd been shot, had flown off when he'd fallen. Now it was a relic of that day, a physical reminder of how close he'd come to dying in this exact spot. Elijah sat down on the log, his leg grateful for the rest, and looked around. This was where Clara had knelt down, where she'd let him climb onto her back. This was where their impossible journey had begun. The memory was vivid despite the time that had passed, the pain, the fear, Clara's patient steadiness as he'd struggled to mount her. "You saved me here," he said aloud to Clara, who stood nearby. "Right here, you decided I was worth saving." Clara flicked her ears toward him but otherwise didn't react. She'd moved past that day, Elijah realized. Animals lived in the present in a way humans couldn't. For Clara, what mattered was now the sun on her back, the sparse grass to graze, Elijah's presence beside her. The past was past. Maybe there was wisdom in that. Maybe instead of dwelling on what had happened, on how close he'd come to death, he should focus on what he still had: life. Home, this faithful companion who'd refused to leave him behind. The future would bring its own challenges, but he was alive to face them. That was more than he'd had any right to expect when he'd fallen bleeding in this spot. The walk back home was even more difficult than the journey out. By the time Elijah's house came into view, he was exhausted beyond anything he'd experienced since leaving the hospital. His legs screamed with every step, and he was certain he'd overdone it badly, but he'd made it. He'd walked to the place where he'd almost died and had walked back again. It felt like a victory, small but significant. That night, his legs swelled and throbbed worse than it had in weeks. Patricia scolded him thoroughly when she came by the next day and saw his condition. "What were you thinking?" she demanded. "You're not ready for that kind of distance. You could have seriously set back your recovery." "I needed to see it," Elijah said simply. "Needed to go back there." Patricia's expression softened slightly. "I understand. But next time you need closure, talk to someone first. We'll figure out a safe way to get you there. Don't be stupid about this, Elijah. You've come too far to ruin your progress with foolish pride." She was right. Of course. But there was something about having made that journey, about having returned to the site of the shooting under his own power with Clara beside him, that felt important. It had been a way of reclaiming that space, of refusing to let it exist only as the place where he'd been shot. Now it was also the place where he'd returned, where he'd proved to himself that he could still push his body to do difficult things. As autumn deepened into winter, Elijah's recovery continued its slow, steady progress. He could walk further each week, could do more tasks without assistance. The home health visits dropped to once a week, then to every other week. Tom Kendrick still stopped by regularly, but now it was more social than necessary. Two older men sharing coffee and conversation rather than a welfare check. David called less frequently, having apparently accepted that Elijah wasn't going to change his mind about staying on the property. Their conversations remained cordial but distant, a relationship maintained out of duty rather than genuine connection. It saddened Elijah, but he didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. They wanted different things from life, valued different things, and at 72, Elijah was too tired to pretend otherwise. His daughter called unexpectedly one evening in early December. They hadn't spoken since before the shooting, and her voice carried genuine concern. "Dad, I heard what happened. I'm so sorry I didn't call sooner. Jeff and I have been dealing with some things, and I should have called." They talked for over an hour, the longest conversation they'd had in years. She told him about her marriage troubles, about how isolated she felt in Colorado, about regrets and missed opportunities. He told her about the shooting, about Clara, about the long recovery. Something shifted in that conversation, a small thawing of the distance that had grown between them. "I'd like to come visit," she said before hanging up. "Maybe in the spring, when the weather's better. I want to meet Clara, want to see the place again. It's been too long, Dad." "I'd like that," Elijah said, and meant it. "I'd like that a lot." Winter in the Sonoran Desert was mild compared to most places, but it still brought changes. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Elijah kept a small space heater running in his bedroom and wore a jacket on the porch in the mornings. Clara grew a thicker winter coat, her grey fur becoming almost woolly. The desert itself seemed to hunker down, waiting for spring. On Christmas Eve, Elijah sat on his porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Clara stood nearby, a dark shape in the gathering dusk. The house behind him was warm and lit, decorated with the few simple ornaments he'd kept from all the Christmases with Margaret. He had a small turkey roasting in the oven. More food than he needed, but he'd eat leftovers for days. Susan Kendrick had dropped off a plate of cookies that morning, and there was a bottle of wine Ramon had sent up from Nogales. It wasn't the Christmas he might have imagined months ago when he'd been lying in a hospital bed wondering if he'd ever see home again. But it was his Christmas, spent in the place he loved with the animal who'd saved his life nearby. The shooting had taken something from him, a measure of health, some of his independence, the illusion of invulnerability that even old men sometimes carried. But it had also given him something, a deeper appreciation for what he still had, a clearer understanding of what mattered, and a bond with Clara that felt sacred in its depth. "Merry Christmas, girl," he called out to Clara. She raised her head from grazing and looked at him, her eyes reflecting the porch light. "Thank you for keeping me alive to see this." The desert night settled around them, cold and clear and perfect. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, and another answered. The stars multiplied overhead until the sky was thick with them, brilliant and ancient and indifferent to human struggles. But here, on this small patch of land, in the presence of this faithful animal, Elijah felt connected to something larger than himself, a story of survival and loyalty that had started with a gift from a friend 17 years ago and had culminated in an impossible journey through the desert. He was alive. Clara was with him. And tomorrow, Christmas Day, he'd wake up in his own bed, in his own house, on his own land. After everything that had happened, that seemed like miracle enough. Winter gave way to spring, and with the warmer weather came renewed energy and determination. Elijah's leg had healed about as much as it was going to doctor. Patel had been clear about that during his last follow-up appointment in Tucson. He'd always have limitations, would always need to be careful, would probably deal with chronic pain to some degree. But he could walk without a cane most days, could do light work around the property, could manage his daily life without constant assistance. The desert exploded with wildflowers that spring, the winter rains having been generous. Mexican gold poppies turned entire hillsides orange, lupines added splashes of purple, and the brittlebush bloomed yellow and bright. The saguaros sprouted white flowers at the tips of their arms, and even the usually austere ocotillos burst into flame-red bloom. The transformation was stunning, a reminder that even the harshest landscapes held beauty for those who knew how to see it. Elijah spent hours outside during those spring weeks, reacquainting himself with his land, checking fences and water tanks, doing small repairs that had been neglected during his recovery. Clara accompanied him on these excursions, walking beside him as she always had, her presence a comfort and a constant. He moved slower than before, took more breaks, accepted his limitations without the burning frustration that had characterized the early months of recovery. His daughter kept her promise and visited in April, driving down from Colorado with her 2 teenage children. Elijah barely recognized his grandchildren. They'd grown so much since he'd last seen them, had become almost adults with their own interests and personalities. They were polite but clearly uncomfortable at first. City kids dropped into a desert ranch with a grandfather they barely knew. But something shifted when they met Clara. The donkey, who could be standoffish with strangers, seemed to sense the importance of these visitors. She let the grandchildren pet her, stood patiently while they asked questions, and even gave them rides around the corral, something Elijah had never seen her willingly do with anyone except him. "She's amazing, Grandpa," his granddaughter said, her earlier reserve melting into genuine enthusiasm. "And she really saved your life? Like, actually carried you for miles?" "She did," Elijah confirmed. "Don't know why, don't know how she knew what to do, but she did it." His grandson, a quiet boy who'd barely spoken since arriving, stood looking at Clara with something like reverence. "Animals know things," he said softly. "They understand stuff we don't." The visit stretched from a planned weekend to 5 days, and by the time they left, something had changed. His daughter hugged him tightly at departure, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry we haven't been around more," she said. "I'm sorry I let things get so distant between us." "I'm sorry too," Elijah admitted. "I could have tried harder, reached out more. Pride gets in the way sometimes. Can we come back this summer? The kids loved it here, and I forgot how much I loved it too. How much I missed this place." "You're welcome any time," Elijah said. "Always." After they left, the house felt particularly quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet than the loneliness he'd lived with for so many years. This felt like contentment, like a life that had found its right shape again after being knocked off course. Tom Kendrick stopped by later that week, ostensibly to drop off some mail that had been misdelivered to his place. But Elijah suspected he really just wanted to check in, make sure Elijah was doing all. Right after his visitors left, they sat on the porch drinking coffee, watching Clara graze in the middle distance. Tom was quiet for a while, then said, "Susan and I have been talking. We want to do something to honor Clara, what she did. Maybe get a plaque made, put it up somewhere public, or contact one of those animal welfare organizations that give awards for heroism." Elijah shook his head slowly. "I appreciate the thought, Tom. I really do. But Clara doesn't need a plaque or an award. She doesn't understand recognition, doesn't care about being honored. She's happy right here, grazing and being a donkey, living her life. But people should know what she did. It's an incredible story. The people who matter know," Elijah said gently. "You and Susan know. Ramon knows. My family knows. That's enough. Clara saved my life, and I get to spend every day being grateful for that. I don't need the whole world to know about it." Tom nodded slowly, seeming to understand. "You're probably right. Still seems like she deserves something, though. She deserves exactly what she has: a good home, plenty of food, and someone who loves her. That's all any of us really want, isn't it?" After Tom left, Elijah walked out to where Clara grazed. The sun was high and warm, and the spring flowers were at their peak. Clara looked up as he approached, ears forward, acknowledging his presence. He scratched behind her ears, and she leaned into his touch with a soft sound of contentment. "Tom wants to give you an award," Elijah told her. "Make a big fuss about what you did. But I told him you'd rather just be left alone to be yourself." Clara's ear swiveled toward him, listening. "I know you didn't save me because you wanted recognition. You did it because, well, because of whatever bond we have. Because you're loyal. Because you're good. Because that's who you are." He stood there for a long time, hand on Clara's neck, feeling her warmth and solidity. The shooting felt like something that had happened in another lifetime to a different person. He was changed by it, physically, certainly, but also in ways that were harder to quantify. He was more aware of his mortality, more conscious of time's passage, more grateful for simple things like morning coffee and sunset light, and this animal's steady presence. "I don't know how many more years I've got," he said to Clara. "Could be 5, could be 20 if I'm lucky. But however long it is, I'm going to spend it right here, doing this. Taking care of you, taking care of this land, living the life I chose." Clara flicked her tail at a fly and continued grazing, unconcerned with philosophical musings about time and mortality. "And when my time comes, I hope it's here too, not in a hospital, not in some facility in Phoenix. Right here, on this land, with you nearby. That would be a good ending, I think. A fitting one." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of desert flowers and warming earth. Somewhere, in the distance, a hawk cried, and closer, a quail called its distinctive 3-note song. The desert was alive around them, continuing its ancient cycles regardless of human drama and near-death experiences. Elijah thought about the question people always asked, why Clara had done what she'd done. How had she known to kneel down? What instinct or intelligence had guided her to carry him miles through the desert to safety? Everyone wanted an explanation, wanted it to make sense according to human logic and understanding. But maybe, Elijah thought, the answer was simpler than all that. Maybe Clara had saved him for the same reason he'd taken her in 17 years ago, when Ramon brought her to fill the emptiness Margaret's death had left. Maybe it was just love, the basic, fundamental bond that forms between creatures who share their lives. Not romantic love, not the complicated love between parents and children, but something purer and more straightforward, the love of companionship, of shared daily existence, of knowing another being so well that their needs become your own. Clara had sensed his need and had responded to it. It was that simple and that profound. She'd loved him enough to refuse to leave him behind, to find a way to carry him to safety, even when it meant walking for hours, bearing weight she'd never been trained to carry. Love had made her do something impossible, had transformed an ordinary donkey into something extraordinary. And maybe that was the real lesson of the whole experience, not that animals were capable of heroic feats, though they clearly were, but that love itself was transformative. It made you stronger, made you capable of more than you thought possible, made you willing to do difficult things for those you cared about. Elijah had spent the years after Margaret's death learning to live with loneliness, accepting it as the price of loving someone so deeply and then losing them. But Clara had shown him that love didn't have to end with death, that new bonds could form, that companionship came in unexpected forms. She'd filled part of the emptiness Margaret left, not by replacing her nothing could, but by being her own presence, her own form of love. And when he'd needed her most, when death had seemed certain and rescue impossible, she'd given everything she had to save him. That was what love did. It showed up in the desert twilight and refused to abandon you, even when common sense said you were already lost. As spring turned to summer and the wildflowers faded back into the desert's usual muted palette, Elijah settled into his new normal. His leg gave him trouble on cold mornings and after too much activity, but he'd learned to work within its limitations. He hired a local teenager to help with the heavier work around the property, and he'd sold off most of his cattle, keeping only a small herd that he could manage without too much strain. David had stopped pushing about Phoenix, had apparently accepted that Elijah was going to live out his days on this land, regardless of anyone's concerns. Their phone calls became more genuine, less fraught with unspoken arguments. And his daughter called regularly now, planning another visit for the fall and talking about maybe spending Christmas at the ranch this year. Life had found a new shape, different from before, but still good, still worth living. Elijah marked his 73rd birthday in June with Ramon's visit and a small cake Susan Kendrick baked for him. He felt his age in his bones and his joints, felt the weight of years and accumulated injuries. But he also felt grateful for survival, for recovery, for the unexpected grace of additional time. Every morning, he'd walk out to feed Clara, and every morning, she'd be waiting at the fence, greeting him with soft sounds and gentle nudges. They'd spend time together, Elijah brushing her coat and talking to her while she stood patiently, and then he'd go about his day while she grazed nearby. It was a simple routine, unremarkable in its daily repetition, but it held everything that mattered: connection, loyalty, the quiet comfort of familiar presence. Sometimes, when Elijah sat on his porch in the evening, watching the sun paint the desert in impossible colors, he'd think about that day in October when a bullet had torn through his leg and started what should have been his last few hours of life. He'd think about lying behind that log, feeling his life drain away, believing his story was ending in blood and dust. And then he'd look at Clara standing nearby, solid and real and alive, and he'd marvel at the strange mercy of the universe that had given him a second chance. He'd been saved by love, not human love, but something equally powerful and perhaps more pure. An animal's devotion, a bond forged over years of shared existence, a refusal to abandon a companion even when every instinct said the situation was hopeless. It was the kind of story people didn't quite believe when they heard it. A donkey kneeling down unprompted, allowing a wounded man to climb on her back, carrying him miles through harsh terrain to safety. It sounded like fiction, like the kind of tale someone made up to pass time around a campfire. But it had happened. Elijah had the scars to prove it, the healed femur, the lingering pain that flared up in cold weather. And he had Clara, living proof that sometimes animals could do the impossible when someone they loved needed saving. The desert stretched away in all directions, vast and ancient and indifferent. But here, on this small patch of land, something remarkable had happened. Life had been saved, love had been proven, and an old man and an aging donkey had been given more time together. In the grand scheme of things, it was a small story, but to Elijah it was everything. He lived each day now with a deeper awareness of its preciousness, never taking for granted another sunrise, another evening on the porch, another quiet moment with Clara's warm presence nearby. The shooting had stolen something from him, but it had also given him a gift, the clarity that comes from facing death and being pulled back from its edge. He knew now, with absolute certainty, what mattered and what didn't. Status, wealth, pride, the opinions of others, these things had lost whatever power they'd once held over him. What mattered was here. The land he'd worked his whole life, the house he'd built with his wife, the animal who'd saved him, the sky overhead vast with stars, the wind carrying the scent of creosote and desert rain. This was enough. This was everything. And however much time he had left, years or months, or however long the universe granted him, he'd spend it right here, living simply, loving quietly, and being grateful for every ordinary day that Clara stood waiting at the fence, reminding him that he was still alive, still needed, still part of something larger than himself. On a warm evening in late September, nearly a year after the shooting, Elijah sat on his porch as the sun began its descent. Clara grazed nearby, her grey coat glowing golden in the slanting light. The desert was settling into that brief window between day's heat and night's chill, that perfect moment when everything felt balanced and right. Elijah thought about all the sunsets he'd watched from this porch, thousands of them over 40 years. Sunsets with Margaret, her hand in his, talking about the day's work or the children or nothing at all, just being together. Sunsets alone after she died, when grief made even beauty feel hollow. And now these sunsets, a year after he should have died, watching the light paint the world beautiful while Clara stood guard nearby. "We're still here, girl," he said to Clara, though she was too far away to hear. "Against all odds, we're still here." The sun touched the horizon, and the sky ignited orange and pink and purple, colors so vivid they seemed impossible. The saguaro stood in silhouette, arms raised as if in celebration. The mountains turned purple and blue, layered against each other in deepening shades. It was the kind of sunset that made you believe in something larger than yourself, some organizing principle of beauty that the universe offered freely to anyone willing to stop and notice. Elijah sat and watched until the last light faded, until stars began to appear in the darkening blue, until the desert night settled around him with its familiar sounds and scents. Clara had moved closer, grazing near the porch now, her presence a comfort and a constant. He rose slowly, his leg protesting the change in position, and walked down the porch steps. Clara lifted her head as he approached, and he wrapped his arms around her neck, pressing his face against her warm coat. She stood still, patient and solid, letting him hold on as long as he needed. "Thank you," Elijah whispered into her mane, "not for the first time, and not for the last. Thank you for everything." Clara made a soft sound, something between a sigh and a nicker, and Elijah felt her breath warm against his shoulder. They stood like that as full darkness fell, man and donkey, survivor and savior, two old souls who'd traveled an impossible road together and lived to tell about it. The desert night surrounded them, vast and starlit and perfect. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang to the rising moon. Closer, the wind rustled through the Palo Verde trees, carrying with it the promise of cooler weather to come. And here, in this small circle of light from the porch, an old cowboy held on to the donkey who'd saved his life, grateful beyond words for another day, another sunset, another quiet evening in the place he called home. Life would continue its inevitable march toward ending for both of them, eventually. But that was tomorrow's concern, or next year's, or whenever the universe decided their time was truly finished. Tonight, they were alive. Tonight, they were together. Tonight, under a sky thick with ancient starlight, Elijah Brand and Clara stood in the desert darkness, two hearts beating steadily, two lives intertwined by chance and choice, and a love that had proven stronger than death. And that, Elijah thought, as he finally released Clara and made his slow way back to the porch, was more than enough. It was everything. It was great.